Why was God so upset that Israel wanted a king? It's a great question. Well, in order to answer it, let's get a little background here. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14, Israel was on the edge of the promised land. Okay, they were on the east side of the Jordan. Moses, who had led them under God's power to that point, was about to die. He was going to turn the reins of leadership over to Joshua. And it's here on the plains of Moab that that Moses was kind of repeating the laws that he had given earlier. Okay? And then adding some new ones in so that God's people would be prepared when they entered into the promised land and when they were surrounded by all those pagans. And we see here in Deuteronomy 17, verse 14, Scripture declares, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. And so we see Moses was writing, let's say, somewhere around 1450-ish BC. And we see here, even before the Israelites entered the promised land, God was already saying in advance that Israel was going to eventually want a king. And God was putting in stipulations for the future king and kings. For instance, verse 16, God said, this king shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. All the things that Solomon obviously failed in, right? Additional stipulations. Verse 18. Now it shall come about when he, the king, sits on the throne of his kingdom. Do you see how God was foretelling that Israel was going to have human kings, right? When he sits on his throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. Okay? So again, around 1450-ish, we see, even before the Israelites entered the land, that God was talking about future kings in Israel. Well, the question is, then why would God have been upset when, fast forward now about 350 years later, Israel's in the land? Why was God upset that Israel wanted a king? Let's see. Go to 1 Samuel chapter 8. We read, it came about when Samuel was old. Okay, Samuel was a judge, a prophet, priest. He was God's man, right? Israel is now in the promised land. Again, about 350 years after we saw what God said through Moses in Deuteronomy. Samuel, godly man, was about to die. He was old. And we see this transition came about when Samuel was old, that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn was Joel. The name of the second one was Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. But unlike their daddy Samuel, his sons did not walk in the ways of the Lord. They turned aside after dishonest gain. They took bribes and they perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "Behold, you've grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways." Okay, that makes sense. We don't want them to lead us because they're not godly. But watch what the people said. "Appoint a king for us to judge us." Finish the sentence. "Like all the nations." Israel was starting to conform to the pagan culture. All the other pagan groups in the promised land had their own kings. And God's people said, "Hey, we want to be like them." And that's why verse 6, the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." Why? Because they had a king, God. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, Samuel, but they've rejected me from being king over them." Why? Because they wanted Israel to be like the other pagan groups. Give us a king like they have. And God said to Samuel, and Samuel was upset, holy anger, which was right, because again, the people were rejecting God, and God said, and this is such a sad thing, because you look at this and you see, look at God. He says, "Samuel, don't worry, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me." Verse 8, God said, "Like all the deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." And God said to them, to Samuel, now listen to their voice. "However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them." They want a king? Like all the other pagan nations? God said to Samuel, "Go ahead and warn them and tell them what your king's going to do to you." Verse 10, so Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He'll take your sons and place them for himself in his own chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots." Don't think that this king is going to exalt all of you. He's going to use you. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some of his to do his own plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give them to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. but the Lord will not answer you in that day. And watch this. Even though Samuel warned them, watch the response of the people. Verse 19, nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. You're shaking your head, Ann, huh? How disgusting. I'm sorry, didn't God set them free from bondage in Israel? Didn't God lead them, protect them, provide for them, and give them victory after victory on their way to the promised land? Did not God give them strength and power and provision to enter the promised land? Did not God give them victory over Jericho, over Ai, over all these other places? And here the people are said, no, we want a human king like the other nations who will judge us and who will lead us and who will give us victory. Now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. And the Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice, appoint him a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go, every man to his city. You see why God was upset? Why? Because of their motivation, their reason for wanting a human king. Again, earlier, 350 years earlier, through Moses, God had already said that there was going to be kings in Israel. God had given stipulations for them, right? But here, 350 years later, you see why the people wanted a king. And again, as God said to Samuel, don't get upset. They're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. They were trusting in human power instead of divine power. They were looking for a human or humans to provide blessings for them instead of God. And sorry, guys, that same problem exists all the time today, doesn't it? Hop over to Jeremiah real quick. The same problem. Verse 17. God makes it very clear, verse 5. Cursed is the man who trusts in mankind and makes flesh, human flesh, his strength, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. Do you see it? But verse 7, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose trust is the Lord. You see the difference right there? God says very clearly, cursed is the man who trusts in the power of man, of himself, of others, of material things. God says, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord. Israel, they wanted to be like the pagan nations, and they were looking for the arm of flesh to provide for them, to protect them, to give them victory, and to bless them. That's why God was upset with them. And it's interesting, in this same context, God says through Jeremiah, verse 9, the heart is more deceitful above all else. It's desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give to each man according to his ways, according to the results of his deeds. Isn't this interesting? In this context, you can tie in this idea of you may think Hey, I'm really trusting in the Lord. But you've got to be careful because your heart can be deceiving you. Maybe in certain things you're trusting in the Lord. Maybe in many other things you're trusting in man or money or yourself. Again, the heart is deceitful above all things. And so we need to protect ourselves from our hearts, right? And we need to constantly be checking our motives. Lord, are you pleased with my methods? Are you pleased with my motives? Lord, am I truly trusting you and you alone? Or am I mixing in some of me? Some of man? Some money? Again, Israel. Oh yeah, we believe in the Lord. We trust in the Lord. But Samuel, can we have a human king like they all have? And so a good kind of internal audit is every day. Lord, are you pleased with my methods? Are you pleased with my motives? And I always add a third one because I always am teaching. Lord, are you pleased with my messages? Don't fall into the trap of saying from one side of your mouth, I trust in the Lord. But out of the other side of your mouth, your true motives are being seen, where you're trusting in man. Do you understand why God was upset with Israel?